The entire auction room laughed when Mason Hale, a single father who welded for a living, paid $22 for a rust-crusted toolbox that had been welded deliberately shut. No one understood why he kept studying the S-shaped seam along the lid, fingers moving across the metal like he was reading something invisible. That night in his garage, Mason cut carefully through hardened steel and went absolutely still when he found a silver machine core stamped with the Harrington Aeronautics insignia. The following morning, a CEO arrived at his front door with a legal team and one offer: $37 million. Stay until the end to find out why the box was welded shut and who needed Mason to stay silent. The liquidation auction for Meridian Fabrication Works had been running since early that Thursday morning, and by midday most of the worthwhile inventory had already been claimed by commercial dealers, who arrived with trucks and clipboards and the particular confidence of men who bought and sold other people's tools for profit. Mason Hale had come for practical reasons: a second-hand drill press or a few clamping sets that would save him money. He was already stretching thin to cover Riley's school expenses and the recurring repair bill on his aging pickup. He worked the outer aisles methodically, checking condition and pricing against what he knew he could afford, the way a man learns to shop when he has more skill than cash and more pride than either. By mid-afternoon, the premium lots were gone, and the floor had thinned to a smaller crowd of browsers picking through what remained, their interest declining in proportion to the quality of what was left. In the far corner, on a low pallet, sat a single item that nobody had touched: a large steel toolbox, roughly the size of a refrigerator laid on its side, covered in a thick reddish-brown coat of surface rust, and so obviously completely welded shut along every seam and panel that the auctioneer had labeled it simply as "contents unknown, sold as is." The auctioneer joked that whoever bought it would probably spend more grinding it open than anything inside would be worth, and the small remaining crowd gave a collective appreciative laugh that carried across the floor. Mason heard the laughter from 12 feet away, but he was not listening to it because he had already stopped moving and was crouching beside the left edge of the box, his eyes fixed on the weld seam running across the lid. It was not the quality of the weld that arrested him. Though it was technically clean, laid with the controlled pressure of someone who understood metallurgy at a molecular level, it was the shape of it, a subtle S-curve that mirrored itself at both the beginning and the end, a finishing signature so specific and so personal that Mason had only ever seen it one other time, in a small shop in Renton, Washington, where an old engineer named Walter Briggs had taught him that a craftsman who truly understood his trade never needed to sign his name because the work itself already spoke it. He stood without announcing anything, bid $22, and accepted the rolled laughter from the remaining room with the expressionless patience of a man who has learned that explaining yourself to strangers is a form of energy he cannot afford. A commercial dealer standing nearest to him made a remark about buying a 200-pound chunk of iron for the price of a lunch, and Mason loaded the box onto his truck and drove home through Tacoma's gray afternoon light without another word. The box sat in the garage. Riley looked at it the way teenagers look at things that do not yet make sense to them. With that particular combination of skepticism and curiosity she had clearly inherited from her father, and asked him why he was more interested in a rusted box than in the broken furnace they had been managing with space heaters since November. He told her that some craftsmen leave their signatures in metal instead of ink, which was true, but was also the kind of answer that creates more questions than it resolves. That evening, after Riley had gone to finish her homework, Mason wiped down the exterior of the box with a clean cloth and discovered beneath a layer of hardened grime 3 small symbols stamped into the lower left panel, notations representing temperature, pressure, and rotational velocity the exact parameter sequence used in a project he had not thought about in nearly a decade, a project called Asterion, the most technically ambitious work Walter Briggs had ever attempted, and the thing that had quietly ended the old man's career when it collapsed. On the underside of the lid, barely legible through a crust of oxidation, Mason found a single line of text etched with a fine point tool, open only when Harrington begins to fail. Mason did not use an angle grinder to open it. A man who had spent 20 years working with precision metals understood that high heat applied carelessly to an unknown container could destroy whatever was inside before he even knew what he was looking for. And Walter had taught him long ago that impatience is the most expensive tool in any workshop. Instead, Mason spent the better part of 2 hours studying the box from the outside, tapping its surfaces with a tuning mallet to map the resonance and locate the internal void, measuring the weight distribution with a postal scale placed under each corner, and identifying the 4 weld points where the metal was thinnest and therefore safest to breach without transferring thermal stress inward. He cut a narrow access panel along the left wall using a low heat method, used a pair of insulated tongs to feel inside the space, and found exactly what the resonance mapping had suggested: a single dense object nested in fire-rated foam at the center, and a smaller bundle resting against the rear wall. He pulled the contents free one piece at a time in the careful way a surgeon removes stitches, and laid them on his workbench under the overhead fluorescent light. There was a titanium cylinder approximately 14 inches long, sealed with a press-fit cap that bore a notation in Walter's handwriting. There was a leather-bound notebook, its pages dense with technical annotations and dates, and there was a sealed envelope with Mason's full name written on the front in the same careful architectural hand he remembered from years of lesson notes and design reviews. The letter was 3 pages long and written without apology or self-pity, in the precise factual tone of a man who understood that the document might one day be read in a courtroom. Walter explained that he had been forced out of Harrington Aeronautics following the collapse of the Asterion rotor test, a test he had believed at the time was sabotaged from within the company, though he had never been able to prove it while he was still alive. He had kept the Asterion X1 master core, the original fabrication data etched into the rotor itself, the test notebook, and the ownership documents that a senior Harrington executive had signed transferring provisional rights to him during the dispute. He had chosen Mason as the repository, not because Mason was the only person he trusted, but because Mason was the only person who had ever learned to read the coordinates engraved directly into the rotor face, a technique Walter had developed precisely because physical metal could not be hacked, altered, or deleted from a server. Mason opened the titanium cylinder and held the Asterion X1 core under the workbench light. It was no larger than the palm of his hand, machined to tolerances he could feel with a fingertip as a near-perfect smoothness, silver gray and dense in the way that only certain aerospace alloys are dense, with the Harrington logo and a prototype designation etched cleanly into the base. The same designation, Mason recalled, that had been officially declared destroyed 12 years before. He found the prototype designation in the public patent database using his phone, and the search returned a single automated result. If you are in possession of this item, contact Harrington Aeronautics Legal Department immediately. Mason photographed just the serial markings and sent them to the listed address, asking only how to verify authenticity. 53 minutes later, the security camera mounted above his garage door recorded 3 black luxury vehicles pulling to a stop in front of his house. Evelyn Harrington stepped out of the lead vehicle, wearing a charcoal jacket over a pale gray blouse, her expression carrying the particular stillness of a person accustomed to entering rooms where the situation had already gotten complicated before she arrived. Beside her was Lydia Prescott, the company's chief legal officer, carrying a leather document case, and two technical specialists in dark coats who had the practiced quietness of people paid to observe and say nothing unless asked. Evelyn did not wait for Mason to speak first. She crossed the driveway, introduced herself without ceremony, and explained in 3 sentences that Harrington Aeronautics had authorized a recovery fund of $37 million for the Asterion X1 prototype, provided the item was confirmed authentic and all associated materials were transferred to the company. She explained the situation without making it sound like a negotiation, which was itself a form of negotiation. Harrington was in the final phase of developing a next-generation rescue propulsion system involving federal certification and billions in future revenue, and every version of the modern rotor they had built failed at a predictable stress point after a specific number of test hours. The Asterion X1 was the only prototype in the company's history that had passed a 20,000-hour endurance test, meaning that its physical structure, the actual metallurgy of the core, which the fabrication coordinates described exactly, could tell the engineering team where the modern versions were failing and why. Without that reference, the project was indefinitely stalled, which meant contracts would collapse, and thousands of employees would find themselves without work by the end of the fiscal year. Evelyn offered $37 million payable immediately after verification, in exchange for the complete package, all associated documents, and Mason's agreement not to publicly discuss the transaction or its circumstances. Mason listened to all of this and then asked the one question he already knew the answer to. If Asterion was that important, why had it spent 12 years inside a welded box in an estate auction? Evelyn said Walter Briggs had removed the core from company custody without authorization before disappearing, and that the company had assumed it was destroyed or permanently lost. Mason set the leather notebook on the workbench between them and opened it to the page bearing the notarized document, the one signed by Evelyn's father acknowledging that Walter retained provisional ownership of the Asterion X1 pending resolution of the technical dispute. Lydia Prescott examined the document seal for nearly a full minute, and then looked at Evelyn without speaking, which was answer enough. Mason said he would not sign a sale agreement that evening. He wanted to understand how a man who had dedicated his career to a piece of technology that worked had ended up accused of stealing it. Evelyn told him he did not fully understand what he was dealing with. Mason said he suspected she did not fully understand what she was trying to buy. The exchange lasted less than 5 seconds and carried more information than either of them would have been comfortable admitting openly. One of the technical specialists, who had been running a handheld scanner over the Asterion core during the conversation, interrupted in a careful tone to report that the core contained a layer of microscale data not represented in any of the company's existing technical documentation. A fabrication annotation so small it required magnification to read, whose presence suggested the core held considerably more information than any Harrington file had ever indicated. The information moved faster than Mason had expected. Within 3 hours of Evelyn's departure, a notification alert appeared on his phone from a news monitoring service he had set up years earlier to track patent filings related to rotor design. But this time the alert was about him. A major financial outlet was reporting that a private individual in Tacoma had come into possession of a Harrington Aeronautics prototype that had been reported as destroyed, and that the company was investigating what it described as an unauthorized retention of corporate assets by a former contractor. The framing was careful but unmistakable in its direction, describing the situation as potential legacy theft being leveraged for financial gain. Conrad Blackthorne appeared at a press briefing that afternoon, speaking from behind a podium in the kind of unhurried, disappointed voice that powerful men use when they want to appear reasonable while describing someone else as unreasonable. He acknowledged that a disgruntled former associate of the late Walter Briggs had surfaced with what he claimed was proprietary Harrington property, and that the company would pursue all legal means necessary to recover assets belonging to its shareholders. He did not name Mason directly, but the journalists present did not require a name to identify who was being discussed, and by early evening, 2 news vehicles were parked on Mason's street. Riley had come home from school to find a stranger attempting to photograph the garage from the sidewalk, and Mason called his sister-in-law that night and asked her to let Riley stay for a few days, explaining it the way parents explain things when they do not want to say they are frightened but need someone else to hear it anyway. Conrad also filed a motion with a state court requesting a preservation order on the toolbox and its contents, arguing the items were Harrington's intellectual property being wrongfully withheld, and he asked Evelyn to co-sign the motion on behalf of the company. Evelyn sat in her office that night, studying the motion and trying to identify the thing that was bothering her about its specificity. What finally clarified it was a detail in the 3rd paragraph. The filing referenced the microscale fabrication data on the core, data that only the technical specialist had mentioned verbally during a private meeting at Mason's house that Evelyn had not reported to the full board in any written form. Lydia confirmed that the auction sale documents transferred the toolbox and all physical contents to Mason unambiguously, which meant the legal foundation of the preservation order was shakier than Conrad's legal team had apparently represented to him. She said she was telling Mason this in her capacity as Harrington's attorney, which technically meant she was not supposed to be telling him this, but that the law sometimes required a person to acknowledge which side of a line they were actually standing on. Mason moved the Asterion package to a third-party secure storage facility that evening, not disclosing the location to Evelyn, because he did not yet fully understand whose loyalty ran in which direction and had learned to be careful about assumptions. Evelyn drove to his garage the following morning without a legal team and told him plainly that she did not fully trust Conrad's account of what had happened 12 years ago, but that if the Asterion project collapsed entirely, the company would shed thousands of jobs, and the rescue propulsion system promised to 3 government agencies would simply not exist. Mason said he would allow the engineering team access to the prototype under one condition. Evelyn would have to reopen the internal investigation into the test failure that had ended Walter's career. Harrington Aeronautics had a secure testing facility in a converted industrial campus south of the city, and Mason entered it on a Wednesday morning as an independent technical consultant, a title negotiated over a single phone call and that he suspected pleased no one on either side of the arrangement. The senior engineers greeted him with the professional courtesy that people use when they have been told by management to cooperate and find it mildly insulting, and Grant Keller, the chief engineer overseeing the Asterion development program, shook Mason's hand with the measured firmness of a man, establishing that the gesture was professional obligation rather than personal welcome. The modern rotor assembly was displayed on a central workbench, rendered in high-grade titanium alloy and technically impressive in every way that a document could describe it, and Grant presented the current design parameters with the brisk confidence of someone who has spent years defending a program against bureaucratic pressure and has no particular interest in defending it against a welder from Tacoma. Mason stood in front of the rotor for approximately 4 minutes without touching it, looking at the cooling channel geometry from 3 different angles, and then asked to see the fabrication specification for the inner ring raceways. Grant pulled the specification up on the facility display system and waited for the vague, admiring response that non-specialists typically produce when they encounter engineering they do not fully understand. Mason pointed to a specific channel angle and said the deviation from the original specification was approximately 1/3 the width of a human hair. The deviation was small enough that it would have passed any routine inspection, but under sustained high-temperature cycling, the asymmetry would cause thermal accumulation at a predictable point in the rotor's operating cycle. Accumulation that increased exponentially with each successive test hour, and that would eventually produce the exact failure signature that Grant's team had been unable to explain for years. Grant said the design had been copied directly from Walter Briggs's original data files, and that what Mason was describing was technically impossible if the transcription had been accurate. Mason said that was precisely the problem, and used the fabrication key encoded physically on the Asterion X1 to demonstrate the discrepancy, walking Grant through the comparison between the coordinates on the original core and the numeric values in the company's data system. The timestamp metadata embedded in the files showed the critical channel specification had been altered after the original test failure, not before, and that the original values had subsequently been purged from the system entirely. Evelyn pulled the access logs and found that Conrad Blackthorne had authorized a system-level data review in the 48 hours following the failed test, conducted under his personal credentials. The fact that Conrad's credentials were used did not legally prove that Conrad himself had made the changes, as he could plausibly argue that another party had accessed the system under his account, but it established a timeline that made the official explanation of Walter's culpability significantly harder to sustain. Mason proposed a comparative replication test. Build 2 rotors, one using the corrupted data, and one using the original coordinates recovered from the physical core, run them under controlled conditions, and measure the divergence directly. Evelyn approved it and asked that the test preparation be kept off the internal project board to prevent interference. They moved forward carefully and quietly, which turned out to be the wrong kind of caution, because 2 days into the preparation, Mason entered the specimen storage room and found that a titanium alloy sample box, the reference material scheduled for the comparison test, had been removed from its storage bay without a corresponding work order. The room's access camera had captured the removal clearly, and the person carrying the sample box out of the facility was Conrad Blackthorne's personal assistant. Evelyn took Mason to her father's private archive on a Saturday morning, when the facility was quiet. A climate-controlled room on the 3rd floor of the original Harrington building, full of filing cabinets that had never been digitized because her father had believed that anything important enough to write down was important enough to protect from network intrusions. He had died 4 years earlier without explaining to his daughter why he had opposed Conrad's full operational control over the Asterion program at every board meeting during the final 2 years of his life, and why he had grown increasingly silent on the subject in the months before his death. The silence of a man who has calculated what silence costs against what speaking costs, and found the latter to be higher than he was willing to pay. In a fireproof filing case labeled only with a year, they found a series of letters exchanged between Evelyn's father and Walter Briggs over approximately 14 months surrounding the test failure, handwritten, cautious in their phrasing, and devastating in their implications. The letters established that Evelyn's father had believed without reservation that Walter was innocent, that the test failure had been the result of deliberate material substitution by someone with access to the specimen storage system, but that Conrad Blackthorne held enough shares and enough institutional relationships to effectively threaten the company's stability if confronted directly. He had done the only thing he believed he could do at the time, transferred provisional ownership of the Asterion X1 to Walter personally, sealed the legal paperwork with a notary he trusted, and hoped that some future moment would arrive when the evidence was strong enough to withstand the confrontation he himself could not afford to make. Evelyn stood in her father's archive and felt the particular grief of learning that the person you admired most was also a person who had made a choice you would have made differently, and that the difference between his choice and yours was mostly that you had the luxury of knowing how the story ended. Mason stood beside her and felt something adjacent, but not identical. The quiet guilt of a man who had been unreachable during the years when his presence might have mattered, not because he was indifferent, but because he had been sitting in a hospital room holding his wife's hand while everything else continued without him. Neither of them said anything for a long moment, and the silence between two people who understand each other's regrets without requiring explanation is a different kind of silence than the one between strangers. Lydia called while they were still in the archive to report that a judge had granted Conrad's legal team a formal inspection order requiring Mason to produce the Asterion package within 72 hours or face obstruction charges. The order had been filed by Conrad's attorney, and it contained a specific reference to the micro-scale fabrication data on the core. Data that, as of the filing date, should have been known only to the people present at Mason's garage the night Evelyn had brought her technical team. Lydia read the relevant sentence twice to make certain they both understood what it meant. It meant that someone who had been in that room, or someone with direct access to that person's notes, was feeding information to Conrad, that the circle of people they could trust was smaller than they had assumed, and that Conrad knew it and had been counting on exactly that. Mason sat with Evelyn and Lydia in a conference room that evening and proposed something that sounded more complicated than it was. He would create 3 variant transcriptions of the fabrication key notation, not the actual coordinates, which were physically embedded in the rotor and could not be altered without destroying it, but 3 slightly different written versions of the sequence, each containing a single unique error positioned at a different location within the data. Evelyn would distribute each version to a separate technical sub-team under the cover of requesting independent verification, a request routine enough to avoid raising attention. If Conrad continued receiving information and used it in a subsequent legal filing, the specific error reflected in that filing would identify which team the information had come from, narrowing the source without requiring direct accusation. Grant Keller pushed back when he was told about the plan, not because he believed it was wrong, but because he understood exactly what it was. A trap laid across his own engineering staff. And he had spent 19 years building a team that trusted each other across 12-hour shifts and equipment failures that sometimes looked like career endings. Mason said he was not assuming guilt. He was assuming that whoever was passing information to Conrad was likely doing it under conditions that did not look like a free choice. That there was a difference between a willing collaborator and a person who had been cornered, and that the plan was designed to find one without permanently destroying the other. Grant thought about that for longer than was comfortable, and then said nothing further, which Mason took as agreement. Over the following days, as the 3 versions circulated and the sub-teams worked independently, Grant and Mason found themselves spending increasing amounts of time at adjacent workbenches, and what had begun as guarded professional tolerance gradually became something closer to the respect that forms between people who discover unexpectedly that they approach problems with the same fundamental logic. Grant told Mason one evening that he had noticed irregular data artifacts in the system logs 4 years earlier and had drafted a report about them that he had ultimately not submitted, and Mason asked why, and Grant said he had a daughter in college and a mortgage, and had done the math on what speaking up would cost him. Mason said he understood the math entirely. The answer came 9 days into the experiment. When Conrad's attorney submitted a second set of motions referencing dimensional tolerances that appeared in only one of the 3 variant transcriptions, the version distributed to the materials verification subteam. The subteam's junior analyst, a man named Adrian Cole, was identified through access timing and communication records that Lydia had quietly flagged for audit, and when Lydia and Evelyn met with him privately, he did not attempt to deny anything. He was visibly exhausted in the way people look when they have been managing a secret that has become too heavy, and he explained that Conrad had approached him 6 months earlier with knowledge of a family debt situation that Adrian had not disclosed to the company and had offered to make manageable in exchange for periodic updates on sensitive project developments. Adrian provided access to an encrypted message history between himself and an intermediary, and the messages documented Conrad's instructions to swap a specific alloy sample before the comparative test in order to ensure the modern rotor continued to fail, a manufactured failure designed to force the board to sell the program to Blackthorn Industries at a distressed valuation. Conrad had already scheduled a board vote to remove Evelyn the morning after the test was supposed to take place. The offer arrived at Mason's garage on a Tuesday evening through an intermediary. A man in a well-fitted suit who accepted the cup of coffee Mason offered him and explained with professional neutrality that his employer was prepared to pay $45 million for the Asterion package, unconditionally $8 million above the Harrington offer, with no contractual restrictions on future use. The condition was that Mason receive the payment within 48 hours, leave the Tacoma metropolitan area for a period of not less than 60 days, and make no public statements about the transaction or its circumstances during that period. The intermediary made clear that his employer had no particular interest in the technology itself. What his employer needed was for the core, the notebook, and the ownership documents to no longer be in a position to surface as evidence in any legal proceeding. Mason thanked him for the coffee, said he needed 24 hours to consider the offer, and spent the next 10 minutes setting up the audio transcription application on his phone to capture the saved recording. He called Evelyn and told her about the visit and about what the offer's structure revealed, that Conrad's objective was not acquisition but elimination. Evelyn arrived within the hour, and the conversation that followed was not comfortable. She was frustrated that he had handled the meeting without telling her beforehand, and she said so directly, which Mason respected even as he disagreed with the framing. He said that if he had called her before the meeting, she would have sent lawyers, and lawyers would have ended the conversation before it produced the information they now had. She said he was making unilateral decisions that affected a company, a legal proceeding, and thousands of jobs, as if he were still working alone in a garage. He said that for most of the previous 12 years, he had in fact been working alone in a garage, and that the instinct had served him adequately. The argument was brief and honest, and resolved without either of them fully conceding the other's point, which was probably appropriate given that neither of them was entirely wrong. Mason told her plainly that $37 million would change his and Riley's life in practical terms he was capable of fully imagining. The security, the choices it would open, the weight it would remove. He said this without embarrassment, because he had found that pretending money does not matter is a luxury that wealthy people invented to feel less responsible for who they outbid. But he also said that he had known Walter Briggs at a time when Walter was still the most technically honest person he had ever met, and that no amount of money changed the fact that Walter had spent the final years of his life carrying a false accusation, because the people around him had found it more convenient than the truth. Riley called that night from her aunt's house and told her father she was not asking him to be a hero. She was asking him to make the decision he would still be able to sit with in 10 years, and that he was the only person who knew which decision that was. The next morning, Mason contacted Evelyn and told her he was not selling the Asterion package to anyone yet. Instead, he was prepared to loan the prototype to Harrington for a formal public test conducted under independent supervision, with the full data stream transmitted live to a third-party verification body that neither Harrington nor Blackthorne had any existing relationship with. Evelyn agreed without hesitation and then apologized, briefly and sincerely, for having spent their first 2 weeks treating him as a problem to be managed, rather than a person to be trusted. Mason accepted the apology without making it larger than it was, and they began the final preparations for the test. Before those preparations were complete, the Asterion X1 disappeared from the third-party secure storage facility at 11:47 on a Thursday night. The access log showed Evelyn's security credentials used at the exterior door and Mason's biometric signature at the interior lock. Neither of them had been there, which the facility's own motion records confirmed, but the log entries were clean and time-stamped and would look persuasive to anyone reviewing them without that additional context. The intrusion detection system registered no alarm, no forced entry, and no anomaly of any kind except for the log entries themselves, which was precisely the kind of clean disappearance that only looks clean until someone examines it from a direction other than the obvious one. Conrad called an emergency board session the following morning, appearing by video with the measured composure of a man who had been rehearsing controlled outrage, and proposed that Evelyn and Mason had staged the disappearance together as a delay tactic to prevent the board vote from proceeding. It was a logically constructed argument, and it would have been more persuasive if Mason had not already been in the storage facility's equipment room with a flashlight, running a particulate analysis on the dust coating inside the combination lock mechanism. The metallic composition of the residue on the dial's interior surface did not match anything in the facility's maintenance records. It was a fine aluminum compound found almost exclusively in the cutting tools used in Harrington's own machine shop. Mason traced the particulate through the facility's ventilation routing, cross-referenced the source with the zoned air exchange records, and located the relevant staging area in a decommissioned parts storage bay scheduled for demolition the following week. Inside a sealed shipping crate marked for disposal, they found a duplicate of the Asterion X1. Surface accurate, visually identical, bearing a copied designation number, packed in a transport configuration that matched the original's documentation exactly. The duplicate had been manufactured to be placed back in the storage facility after the original was removed, to delay discovery of the exchange. The person who had built it was skilled, careful, and had been almost right about everything. The deviation was 3 grams. The duplicate was 3 grams heavier than the original, a discrepancy that Mason identified because Walter had taught him in his first month of apprenticeship to weigh any component before trusting its designation number, on the grounds that numbers could be copied, but mass could not. Grant confirmed the duplicate's origin by cross-referencing the machine shop fabrication logs, which showed an unauthorized overnight run on the precision lathe operated by Conrad's personal assistant. The original Asterion X1 had been transported to the facility's thermal processing unit, a high-temperature cycling furnace used for alloy stress testing, and placed in the overnight automated cycle that would have begun at 4 in the morning and reached the temperature threshold at which the rotor's fabrication data would have been permanently and irreversibly degraded. Mason and Grant reached the furnace room with 40 minutes to spare and halted the cycle before the temperature climbed past the threshold, using an override sequence Grant had memorized from a routine safety certification 3 years earlier. The Asterion X1 was intact. The thermal exposure had loosened a section of the protective coating on the base plate. a section that had been applied over the original surface as a deliberate concealment, not factory finishing, and beneath it, arranged in a sequence of micro-engraved characters requiring a loop to read, was a final set of notation Walter had inscribed directly into the metal before sealing the box. The notation matched no existing Harrington document but corresponded precisely to a type of storage reference Mason had seen Walter use once before, for an offline data backup Walter had described at the time as his insurance policy. The notation resolved to a digital storage account created through an offline archival service that Walter had registered 9 years before his death, using a provisional access key embedded in the notarized ownership document. Lydia submitted the legal paperwork that afternoon and received access authorization within 6 hours, which was faster than any of them expected, and suggested that Walter had arranged for expedited access under exactly these circumstances. That he had, in other words, designed the entire system with the assumption that whoever followed the trail would be doing so under time pressure and would need the last door to open quickly. The archive contained a single audio file, 41 minutes long, recorded in what sounded like a small room with the ambient background noise of ventilation and the occasional distant sound of industrial machinery. The recording began with 2 voices. Walter's was immediately recognizable, careful, measured, speaking with the deliberate precision of a man who knew the recording was happening and wanted every word to be usable. And the other was Conrad Blackthorne's, recognizable from years of public company statements, in a tone considerably less measured than the one he used in boardrooms. The conversation documented, in detail, a negotiation that had taken place in the week before the Asterion test failure. Conrad had wanted Walter to approve a substitution of alloy suppliers for the rotor sample material, a substitution that would have reduced fabrication costs and simultaneously benefited a supply contract held by Blackthorne Industries. Walter had refused on the technical grounds that the substitute alloy had not passed the durability certification required for aerospace-grade components. Conrad had made clear that the refusal was unacceptable, and that if Walter would not cooperate, the test would nonetheless produce an outcome that suited the company's financial position. Walter had recorded the meeting because he understood, as of that conversation, that the outcome was no longer within his control. The recording was compelling but not independently sufficient. An opposing attorney could challenge the file's integrity, argue it had been edited, or question the chain of custody across the decade it had been stored. What made it evidentiary rather than merely persuasive was the physical corroboration. The precise timestamps in the audio file's metadata matched coordinates embedded directly in the Asterion X1 rotor face, which documented the test conditions at the moment of the failure in a form that existed in metal and could not be retroactively altered without machining away the rotor itself. The audio and the rotor told the same story from 2 different media, and the probability of that alignment being coincidental was, as Mason explained to the assembled engineers, mathematically indistinguishable from 0. Evelyn made the decision in the conference room that evening without visible hesitation. She would not accept a private settlement, negotiate a quiet resolution, or allow Conrad to exit through the kind of managed corporate transition that powerful people use to leave scandals without leaving fingerprints. She called a full board meeting for the following morning and gave the legal team 12 hours to prepare the comprehensive evidentiary presentation. Conrad received a standard meeting notification with no unusual detail and arrived the next morning in his customary seat at the head of the conference table, composed in the way that a person is composed when they believe they still control the room. He opened the meeting by noting that Evelyn had apparently spent $37 million of shareholder funds pursuing the claims of an anonymous welder, and that the board would need to address whether that expenditure represented sound fiduciary judgment. Mason walked through the door carrying the Asterion X1 and the original ownership documents, and took the seat that Lydia had placed at the far end of the table. He did not make a speech. He began with the fabrication data and the timestamp discrepancy, moved to the physical comparison between the modified design and the original, then to the audio recording, then to the material substitution evidence, and then to the encrypted message history, presenting each item in the sequence that made it hardest to isolate any single piece from its broader context. Conrad demanded that the entire evidentiary case be set aside, unless Mason was prepared to demonstrate in real time that the Asterion X1 actually outperformed the current design under controlled conditions, arguing that theoretical data and historical recordings were insufficient grounds to overturn a conclusion the company had operated under for 12 years. Mason said he was prepared to run the test immediately if an independent certification body was present to validate the methodology, and Evelyn confirmed that representatives from a materials testing organization were already in the building. She had contacted them the previous evening. The test configuration took 3 hours to assemble under joint supervision, with the Asterion X1 mounted alongside a rotor fabricated using the corrected fabrication key coordinates Mason had reconstructed. The session recorded by the certification body on independent equipment with a tamper-evident chain of custody. Conrad sat in the observation area watching the setup with the patience of a man who had decided that ambiguity, managed correctly, still left him enough room to operate. The initial phase ran identically for both rotors. Stable output, nominal temperature distribution, no anomaly of any kind that could be pointed to as a meaningful difference, and Conrad allowed himself a small visible settling into his chair. The divergence began 40 minutes into the elevated temperature phase as the thermodynamic stress on the cooling channels compounded across the test cycle. The rotor built from the modified data began showing micro-vibration signatures above the certification threshold. Small at first and then definitively measurable, the accumulated consequence of a single channel angle deviation expressed across thousands of heat cycles. The rotor built from the original fabrication key coordinates remained within specification throughout the entire test window, performing exactly as the 12-year-old notebook had said it would. Grant Keller, who had spent 4 years trying to understand why his team's designs kept failing at exactly this phase, sat in the observation room and did not speak for several minutes after the divergence became unambiguous. Grant stood and formally acknowledged, on the record, that his engineering team had been working from corrupted design data for the entirety of the program's modern iteration, not because anyone on the team had made an error, but because the data they had been given was not the data Walter Briggs had actually written down. Lydia presented the full evidentiary package. The board moved to an immediate emergency executive session, and Conrad was suspended from his position pending formal investigation and asked to leave the building. He departed with the same controlled composure he had arrived with, which struck Mason as the most revealing thing he had done in the entire proceeding. The independent certification body completed its assessment the following week, confirming that the Asterion package represented commercial technology with a verified valuation of $37 million. Evelyn presented Mason with the formal offer that afternoon. He agreed to license the technology rights with one specific condition. The licensing agreement would include no clause requiring any party to suppress, minimize, or decline to publicly acknowledge the role of Walter Briggs in the development of the Asterion system. Walter's name, and the accurate account of what had happened to him, would be part of the permanent record. 3 months after the board session, Harrington Aeronautics held a small ceremony in the main atrium of its engineering campus, to formally designate Walter Briggs as the founding engineer of the Asterion Technology Program, adding his name to the facility's technical heritage wall beside 3 other engineers whose work had shaped the company's history. The recognition arrived too late to mean anything to Walter himself, and mattered anyway, because the record a person leaves belongs not only to them but to everyone who comes after and needs to know that the work was real and was done honestly. Mason deposited $37 million, and then spent a weekend deciding what the money actually meant in practical terms. He paid for Riley's education in full, cleared the house mortgage, established an endowment at a community technical college for precision mechanics training for students who could not afford 4-year programs, and transferred the remainder into an engineering ethics foundation bearing Walter's name, providing legal and financial support to technical professionals who reported design violations or safety failures through official channels. Harrington Aeronautics completed the Rescue Propulsion System certification 8 months after the board session, signing agreements with 3 federal agencies and 2 international partners, a result that Evelyn reported without the triumphant framing that would have turned Walter's ordeal into a marketing narrative, because she had decided that some stories are owed more than they are worth as advertising. She drove to the garage on a Sunday afternoon and brought the toolbox with her, restored, the exterior cleaned and treated. The access panel that Mason had cut still open and unrepaired, preserved as a record of the night the contents were finally found. She asked why he was still welding and teaching when the money made it entirely optional. He told her that money expands the range of choices available to a person but cannot replace the specific satisfaction of making something that was not there before. She laughed, which was not something he had heard her do in any of the professional settings where they had spent most of their time together, and told him she was inviting him to dinner, not as a CEO conducting a negotiation, but as a person who had found the conversation genuinely interesting and wanted to continue it without a legal team present. Mason said yes. He locked the garage and walked out past the empty workbench, past the bracket where the welded shut box had once sat rusted and ignored, and understood for the first time that the most valuable thing Walter Briggs had left inside it was not the $37 million core. It was the choice to finally open it, and to refuse to let what had been sealed inside stay buried any longer.
Bro? Alright, which way are we going? Oh. Figured it out. Oh shit. Is this a hard boss? The Black Wind King?
Years. I have rebuilt the temple. Now it's grander in scope.
This is the second last boss fight. It's not that hard.
Turn to wandering ghosts roaming in Black Wind Mountain.
I'm in the beginning of the game. There's no way this is
It
the
was
last boss
I
fight. Or second to last boss.
granted them eternal repose.
Dude, strong as fuck.
Restored the charred scriptures piece by piece. But oh yes, I always knew. One day
It is, and you have to fight a bear, and that's it. True. Oh wow.